This week's episode is sponsored by Samsung.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For 50 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. My name is Alan Weitz.
And I'm Jill Waterman.
And if you're a regular listener to the show, you just know that our audio engineer, Mike Weinstein, will be popping in with a question or two over the course of the show. Question of the day. What would lead a pediatrician from suburban Long Island to spend his precious downtime prowling around in a notoriously rough neighborhood in the Bronx? Better yet, how did he end up befriending and embedding with a violent street gang, not for an afternoon or two, mind you, but over the span of a 3-year photo project? We're talking a white guy with a camera making like a fly on the wall in the home of a Mitchell housing gang leader. You can't make this up. Today's episode packs a double punch. Since the backstory responsible for causing our guest to pick up a camera in the first place and dance with the devil, as he describes his work, is a wrenching tale of pain, loss, and unfathomable guilt. We'll bring you up to speed on the whole story shortly, but first we'd like to extend a huge thanks to dedicated listeners Tim Floyd Photo, John Love 5986, Kitty Films Austin, Land of Dar, Cessna 6535, and Michael Pierce 979 for their insightful comments they posted to our recent episodes on B&H's YouTube channel. It's so great to hear from you all. We're keeping your comments and suggestions in mind for future shows, so stay tuned for new episodes that you've helped us build. And we've said before, we'd like to think of the B&H Photography Podcast as a collaboration with our listeners, and this recent engagement is a case in point, and it's setting our hearts aflutter. Now, back to our guest. To guide us on this complicated walk on the wild side of gangs, drugs, and guns is Dr. Greg Gulbransen, a Long Island-based pediatrician who's been making photographs since 2014. A tragic car accident involving his 2-year-old son in 2002 led him to channel grief into action. If you think backup cameras on cars is a brilliant safety idea, you can thank Dr. Gulbransen for that. After a 15-year battle with the U.S. auto industry, he succeeded in cementing legislation requiring rear-view cameras in all American cars. Thank you. After starting out taking wildlife photographs and editorial fashion work, both of which I might add, the good doctor is quite good at, Gulbransen transitioned to documenting the lives of unique individuals with interesting stories in an aim to preserve the unique legacies through photography. This work is often informed by a drive to highlight issues impacting American society with a focus on young people. Over the course of 3 years, he photographed Malik, a set leader of the violent street gang, the Crips. In 2018, Malik was shot and paralyzed by a bullet from the rival gang. As a result, Malik's world is now centered around his small Bronx apartment, where he's cared for by his family and fellow gang members. Gulbransen's pictures from this series are soon to be released in a monograph, Say Less, coming out this summer from Gost Books. Dr. Greg Gulbransen, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I have arrived, right?
You've arrived. You're there, baby. Now, you work professionally as a pediatrician, and you began making pictures in 2014, initially traveling to far-flung locations to photograph wildlife. At what point did you decide to turn your camera onto the Bronx as a photographic subject?
So I had done my psychiatry rotation in the Bronx. We had a choice as a New York medical school, where do you want to rotate to? And I said, man, I just want to go for the throat. So I'm going to go right into the Bronx and do psychiatry because that's where probably lots of pathology. And I was right. And I spent 3 months there at St. Barnabas Hospital, right next to Arthur Avenue, where, by the way, I had the best lunches. And really got a sense of the vibe. I was very, very afraid of the place. In fact, to be quite frank with you, walking from the parking lot to the hospital with our white lab coats on and our little buck shoes, I don't know how we didn't get shot back then, but, I was just very impressed by the place. It had a vibe, and I was afraid of it, but I didn't plan on going back, that's for sure.
So you were aware of the dangers of that area. I mean, it's a hotbed of violence. If that's what you're looking for, that's where you go.
Absolutely true.
Now, as a white guy from the suburbs hanging out in Bronx street corners, you had to stand out like a sore thumb, honestly. How did you initially go about finding subject matter and individuals willing to be photographed in an environment, let alone even willing to talk to you?
You know, at one point, my wife said to me, why do you have to keep going so far to take pictures? She missed me, and, you know, I missed her. So it was like, all right. And all of a sudden, you know, all the pain that I was going through, I said, yeah, you're right. And I really do love people. People are complex and they're fascinating. And I realized that the emotion that you can capture with a camera of somebody's face is more powerful than any emotion we could ever recreate in special effects in Hollywood. And it's all about people's emotions and people's stories. And my dad liberated Dachau. He was in the second tank. And my great-grandfather in the 1920s, 1930s was a fireman in New York City. So when we grew up, we had these black and white pictures of World War II, Dachau, and the Battle of the Bulge, and firemen in New York City, and black and white photography. And I was just like, wow, there was something clicking in the back of my mind. I didn't realize it. So I ended up one day wanting to go to the Bronx Documentary Center. To this day, I've never been there, but I did drive up to the front door and it was locked. And I said, all right, meanwhile, you know these bands of these motorcycles and dirt bikes that fly around the city? About 50 of them went flying past me, and I actually followed them to the back of 138th Street, and I saw where they were hanging out. So I decided there's something here, but I didn't know what it was. So I went back a few different Sundays, and I saw on the side of the road, trying to emulate them, a group of young kids between 9 years old, 12 years old, and then it was like a 30-year-old father, and some people in their 20s, and they had bicycles. And I was very enthralled by it. I said, wow, check this out. And I'm always drawn to kids. And I actually befriended him when it was a cold winter day. And I said, I'm going to come back. And he said, yeah, you know, and the leader of it, who's my good friend now, Macho, said, I'm trying to keep these kids away from guns and drugs and gangs. And he had a nickname for his little group. It was Bikes Up, Guns Down. And I was like, Bikes Up, Guns Down, that's cool. So I made t-shirts for these kids, bought them some gloves, some hats, and we would ride and I would take pictures. I had no idea of the different genres of photography. I didn't know what documentary photography was. I just knew wildlife photography. And I said, you know, I'm going to just try to take some pictures. So I started doing that and befriended these guys, and I kept going back. 3 years later, they said to me, you know, we thought the whole time you were a Fed. So I had my hospital ID on me. I would text them all the time and FaceTime them. And, you know, I really worked very hard. And
you maintained a connection with them.
Yes, I did. And I kept going back and back every Sunday almost. And they fell for me. Listen, I'll tell you something with a camera. You know this as well as I do. When you put a camera on somebody, if you do it the right way, they want their story told.
Yeah.
They loved it.
You know, you also mentioned something that just got my head working. You're a pediatrician. You're dealing with children. You're dealing with parents. And sometimes you have to talk about things that are not real comfortable and could be just real awful in many, many ways.
Yep.
Okay?
The worst.
And you're talking about connecting with people and looking at these faces. And you basically took these faces and put them into your office. You basically just, it sounds like you moved them from a street corner to your office. And now you're dealing with just a person. To hell with the rest of the surroundings. It's irrelevant. And that kind of is what got you in the door. You were able to connect with them because as a physician, you have to learn to be able to talk to people on different levels, serious as well as light.
It's very interesting. You could come to my house, yell and scream at me, throw paint on the wall, you know, cause trouble in my life. But if you're in my office, I'll treat you like you're my son or my daughter. And you also put away the visions of colors and sexuality, and you just do.
Preconceptions, you deep six them.
Yeah, you deep six them. And it's about connecting eye to eye. What's your story? I don't care anything about what you think. Prejudge me, whatever. It's, you got a story. You're a good person. Can we hit this off? And you just connect with people. That's all. And just treat them fairly. And that's what it's about. You have to put away your prejudices. You just got to dump them. People are complex and they're beautiful, but that's what you do. You just look at people straight up.
It seemed like it didn't take long from the time where you just said hello to the point where you were comfortable enough to lift the camera to your eye. And I would have assumed that it took longer, but it sounds like you were pretty much from the get-go on the same channel, the same frequency with them, and there was a trust early on. Is that safe to assume?
Yes. Yeah, there's a science to what you do, and there's an art to what you do. And With photography, when you're talking to people, it's really mostly art. You have to be able to read people and look at people and body language and your facial expressions. Because in my office, we see about 24,000 patients a year. I see about 80% of them. So, you learn how to read people and how to treat people. And I see everything in the office, right? All kinds of people. And you just get good at it and you can connect. The only time that it's hard to predict people and is when they're really on a lot of drugs.
Right.
Because then the game is off. Their neurology is off and you better step back. Better be careful.
Did you have that come up with you a lot because drugs were part of what you were experiencing during this 3 years? I mean, did it overpower you at any times or become dangerous?
Well, there have been times, particularly in a more recent project I'm working on. I mean, there's an opioid epidemic in the Bronx, across the country, but certainly the Bronx is a real hot spot, particularly around certain projects like the Mott Haven projects and more than the Mitchell projects. And then there's crack cocaine, and a lot of them do both at the same time. So, yeah, when you see that stuff, you can recognize it. You just have to know how to behave. And I've been around a lot of crack and a lot of opioids too. I don't ask for it. I don't, seek it out, but there it is. So you have to be careful.
So these kids on bikes, were they mainly just riding around for fun? Did they ask you what you were going to do with the pictures?
I never, ever, ever thought I would make a real book in my whole life. I really do work full time, guys. I'm working 6 to 7 days a week. And I just said, I'm going to make a personal book. And I did. It was called Ride Out. And they were so happy. And I remember when I actually made the book, I met a bunch of them down at Penn Station. And they were just so proud and so happy. But from the beginning, the young people, they trusted me. Look, you don't ask the wrong questions.
Right.
You don't say, is there a gun in your backpack? I mean, you have to assume there's guns in a bunch of backpacks, but you don't ask them that question. You have to behave a certain way. And they'll let you say, there's a lot of tricks. You have to know the people at the top. So I knew right away to make good friends with Macho. Macho was in charge of this particular gang of bikers on 140 in Brook. He runs the block. I went right to Macho. We had a very good friendship. He's actually come over to my house a few times since then. And I brought actually one time a bunch of these kids to my house for a pool party in the backyard. So they knew that they could trust me.
So Macho, there's a ostensible reason that he's working with these kids, which is
Yes.
get him out of trouble and get him into something more productive. Was that his MO, and was he successful?
That was Macho's MO for quite a while, and he was very aggressive at it. He did run that corner and that block, and everybody knew. And at that time, a lot of the different groups of bicycle riders would meet in certain parts of the Bronx, and it was picked up on Instagram, and everyone would know where the ride-outs are going to start. And a lot of them would start there, and I would photograph while I'm on my bicycle. He worked very hard at making sure that those kids were not going to get into the gangs and into the guns, and he was good about it. So I decided to work with him. I said, you know what? He's good. He's good for kids. He's good in the community. I'm going to spend time with these guys. This is a good thing.
Wow. What kind of photo gear are you carrying around when you're up in the Bronx?
Okay, I started off with a Nikon 810, and I would mount on my chest a little mount where I could put the 810 on with I think it was a 24-70 zoom, and I would just ride no-handed down the street following these guys from the northern part of the Bronx down to the lower part of Manhattan, with police cars and police scooters following us the whole way. And they knew not to bother me, and I always stayed in the back third of the pack. Don't go to the back of the pack. Don't go to the front of the pack. That's where the trouble is. Go to the back third so you can watch what happens. And we would go through Times Square. If you really want to have a fun time, ride with these guys through Times Square. It's pretty funny on a Saturday afternoon. Everyone cheers them on. It was a wild time for sure. It was a special time.
How did you transition from the bike riding kids to your other project with the gangs?
After a while, I realized, okay, this is fun. Other people are doing the same thing. I see them on Instagram. I never really see a strong picture coming out of any of this. Maybe one or two, but it just wasn't right. And I eventually said to Macho, why is there so many people in the Bronx riding around in wheelchairs? He said, those are spinal cord injuries. And I figured, all right, so car accidents, and they were hit by cars walking across the street, because you see a lot of that. And then people fell out of buildings, whatever. And then, no, they've all been shot. And I said, all right, enough. Enough of this bikes up, guns down. What is actually going on here? I said, Macho, why don't I photograph everyone in this community who's been shot and is still alive? You want to do that? And he said, I'll introduce you to some people. And then he came to me one day and said, one of the riders he used to ride with, he was shot recently and he's in a wheelchair. And I said, that's it. I want to meet him. So I went up to Malik's apartment with a mutual friend of ours named Flip. And he was in the Crips. And I said, hey, it's Dr. Greg here and wanted to meet you. And there he was, stiff as a board, handicapped in his bed. And he was paralyzed from the chest down. And I said, they told me about you. I said, I didn't think you were actually as ugly as you are. And I knew right away, because when I use lines like that, you could see us laughing. And I said, all right, I got this. We can hit it off. So we started working together slowly. And there were times where I would come in twice a month. There were times I wouldn't go in for 6 months. And then eventually I got more and more into it because it was a bit of a scary thing, but I knew to make friends with him, to make friends with his mom. His mom, Iana, runs the block. And to make friends with a guy named Murder. His real name is Dion. And these people were the kingpins in that little neighborhood. So I knew to really befriend them and take care of them and get along well with them. And then it slowly built over time. And eventually, when I would visit Malik, at the end of every single visit, to this day, because I still visit him often, he says, I love you, Greg, as I'm walking down the hall. And I just say right back at you. So we built up a very good relationship. Very complicated, actually.
Is it safe to assume that your relationship with Malik and his mom is one of the reasons why perhaps your camera was not robbed from you during the course of the 3 years? Do you think that had anything to do with it? Because it seems to me walking around with any kind of camera gear, ultimately someone's going to pop you over the head for it, is my guess.
I was thinking about it because you guys have a lot of very wonderful street photographers in Manhattan on these shows. And there's such a good group of them down in Midtown and Lower Manhattan. What they're doing to me is risky, right? I don't feel comfortable just walking someone with a camera and taking their picture. So I admire those people. I have to marry you first. And then I'm going to take pictures. That's my style. I'll do one story forever. So I did know that it was a smart idea to get involved with her. For instance, one time there's, you probably know this, Word on the Street. That's a YouTube channel. That's actually the feds. And they feature gang stories all around the country from Alaska to Florida. And you might know that's one recent one about the ABG, which is the little set of the Crips that we're talking about here today.
Right.
And that one goes over Malik and his shooting. There's several of them. There's another one coming out. But some of those people actually think, it's an individual driving around doing these things. And I'm like, wait a second. You guys think it's one individual? That's the feds making these videos. They're all around the country. So one day I was walking up 138th and I heard someone coming up behind me and I decided to move faster. And this is like 2 PM on a busy street. And I could hear him on the left side and all of a sudden it was on the right side. I said, okay. So I moved to my left and the person made a diagonal turn across the street going towards the bodega where I'm ultimately going to go. So I decided to walk straight across the street and I watched and I knew where I was going. I was going to really my home zone for sure. And as I walked into the bodega, that same guy came up behind me and says, listen, you got to get out of here with that camera. You making these videos about these gangs. You're a bad guy. We're going to take you out. Malik's mother's boyfriend was in the bodega at the time. He ran out. I since refer to him as my security guard. I went outside, quickly left, took a picture from my car to see who it was, and got out of there quick. And I called Ian, I called Murder, I called a few people and said, listen, this guy just came after me. And they said, who? So I sent them the picture and they said, we got you. And his name was Bad Vibes. And I had met him before and they went out and settled the score. That's all I can tell you. So Bad Vibes doesn't cause any problems anymore. But they actually thought it was me making, words in the street. You've seen those videos? They thought it was me.
So hold on. So Greg, just because I'm flummoxed here, what do you mean by the feds? Because I do know that YouTube channel and I saw the video that you sent us earlier. Do you mean to say that that's the FBI?
Yeah, from what I've been told, that's not the New York City Police Department because they're doing Bridgeport, Connecticut. They're doing Detroit. They're doing Anchorage, Alaska, Florida, California. So that's not a local little channel. It's got to be the federal government. And if you watch them closely, there's a lot of messages in there about trying to clean up your life. You could be like this basketball who came from these projects and this basketball player did really well and he joined the NBA and he made something out of himself. You'll see those little messages stuck in there.
Yeah.
I had a friend who spent several years photographing the Roma gypsies, and he'd fly over once or twice a year. And he learned early on to always carry extra cash because part of the deal was they invariably would steal his cameras from him within a day or two. And then he had to buy it all back from them.
Yeah.
And that was the game, and that was his price of admission to have access to them. They would steal everything, and then you want it? It'll cost you this much.
Yeah. To tell you the truth, I didn't have any problem telling you. I always have a $10 or $20 bill in my right pocket, just waiting for something.
Mm-hmm.
And Christmas Eve around 1 o'clock, the office always gets quiet in pediatrics because we never close, right? So, but around 1:30, 2 o'clock, you're pretty much done. The first thing I do is I get lots of gifts that I put together for his family, jackets, coats, I really like that Patagonia jacket, Dr. Greg. So, I loaded up sneakers and stuff like that. And my son and I go in there and we will spend Christmas Eve with that family. And I'll make sure Malik, his mom, his dad, the boyfriend, the nieces, nephews, Malik's son, everybody, let's have a gift together. And I bring in pizza, they make chicken. And then we all hug and you say, all right, we're going to go home. And then we go home to our fancy house and have our Christmas. But, I do that each year. It's important because they give me their soul and they have exposed themselves and they're very kind. And they're actually really good friends. So, that helps too, I guess. I don't pay anybody off. But I do always have, like I said, a $20 bill in the pocket. You never know when something's going to happen. Just get them off your back.
Yeah.
Well, the 800-pound gorilla is that no matter who you're friends with, you're friends with Malik and his mom, but Malik got popped and he's paralyzed. So it can happen even to the top brass. Whatever you want to say about what precautions you take, it's dangerous.
Yeah.
And you made a choice to live your life in such a way that you feel it's enriched by this experience, even at the expense of perhaps a little bit more risk. It's worth it.
Yeah, I think with the arts, if you look at a lot of the artists, and you know this better than I do, background trauma tends to bring out incredible work, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why I turned to that. It's definitely dangerous, and I would not recommend people do this. But there's just a way to do it. There's lots of rules that I follow. There's lots of things that I tell myself, stay in the zone. There's certain things you just don't do. You don't photograph food pantries lined up. People they have a lot of pride. You don't ever do that. I don't do random street photography. Like I said, I have to have a relationship with someone. You also have certain eye contacts. Never, ever point in the Bronx. Do not point. Do not raise your hand.
So, Greg, how long was it after you met Malik that you started photographing or pulled out your camera?
I think probably the first day, maybe I took one picture of him in his kitchen looking out the window, and then I decided to come back. That first time I was really there, spending time with him just for that purpose. His mom was changing him and was lifting him up into his wheelchair. His mom is amazing. She changes his diaper, changes his catheter, dresses him, and picks him up, puts him in the shower. Now, she doesn't always do it by herself, but she can do all those things. So that was the first picture. It's almost like a Christ-like picture where she's reaching for him on the bed and the wheelchair's on the side. And so back then, I was using the Nikon 810 and I had a Profoto flash, and I'd flash with a big Zeiss Otis 28 millimeter. I was not carrying small stuff at all. Eventually, I switched over to Leica, the Q2 monochrome, and I just sneak it under my jacket. It's so much easier. But that's how I started taking those pictures. And I would do it randomly. I didn't like to say I'm coming in at 3 o'clock. I didn't like telegraphing my patterns. I don't think it's a good idea.
Right. But would you let them know, like, I'm coming today?
Sometimes I would, and sometimes I wouldn't, because I just thought it was a good idea not to tell people what you're doing. And if I ever got to my car, parked my car, and ever put a camera bag in there and had to leave the car temporarily, I would have to move the car. I didn't want anyone to even know I had camera gear in there.
Right.
Although if you park right in front of his place, nobody touches the cars because they're all watching. It's all their cars. So his street itself has no car theft. But the other areas, you have to be very careful with your movements. Yeah, always have to realize people are watching you. And if they're not, just pretend they are and just behave accordingly.
Whew, man. I have a question about Malik's mom. Now, she grew up in the apartment that you were in. Is that correct?
She grew up in that apartment. Her mom, she grew up there. Her whole life she's been there. Malik's there.
So this is their world. But now here's a question. And she also, from what I'm gathering, takes responsibility for a lot of the other young men in the neighborhood and kind of keeps an eye on them. She takes them in as quote unquote mom when they're out there by themselves, is what I'm gathering. How does she feel about the fact that a lot of these young men who she's taken under her wing, literally, ended up in jail or dead? How does she process that?
She calls them her warriors. And she said, this is the reality of my life. I live in the hood. This is tough stuff. Cassius in the book was 6 years old, being raised across the street by a drug-addicted mom, and Yana didn't approve of it. She went across the street one day, grabbed him by the arm and said, "He's mine. You don't know what you're doing." She raised Cassius. And then there's Malik. So they were raised together. And on the weekends in the summertime, she said she would wake up sometimes when they were younger and there'd be 8 to 10 boys sleeping. There'd be boys sleeping in the closet because they knew they could rely on her to take care of them, feed them. And that's just, that apartment, 4G, was always the hotbed. And so this is her thing. She doesn't know any other way.
I'm quite taken by that. I really, really am.
She married Sean. He's in the book. Sean is second generation crack dealer. His mom used to make the crack. Sean learned how to make the crack. He shot somebody when he was 13. He was arrested at 13 by pulling a big Uzi out on an FBI agent. Eventually, he ended up going to Supermax prison. I believe it's 3 generations of crack dealing. I don't know if he does it right now. I can't say that. But, he did tell me that there's 3 generations. And that's all they know. That's what they know. So that's the zip code. It's hard.
Were there any situations you avoided taking pictures of or walked away from because it was just too dangerous, or the legality was just more than you wanted to deal with?
So, there are certain situations that I won't do, but there's one that pops out. One time in Harlem, there was a funeral for one of his buddies that was shot. And I said, okay, I'm going to try to get to that funeral. It was a wake, actually. And when you're shot in New York City, the city pays for your wake and funeral. They get up to $5,000. But it takes a long time. So the bodies kind of sit around for a while, and it's weeks later it happens. We're out here in the suburbs, it's quick. So when I went to the wake, a lot of people outside, and I didn't look like I was very invited, which is fine. But I remember when Malik did show up, I was waiting for him for a long time. There was probably about 80 people outside, and I walked over to him, and he gave me a look, and he said, "Greg, not today." So I walked away quietly, got in my car, and it turns out about a half an hour later, there was a massive fight. No one pulled a gun. It was a big, big fight. So he said, "Just get out of here. It's not going to work." So he knew.
Wow.
He knew.
And he knew you well enough to say, "Leave."
Get out.
Which is good.
No, I don't push buttons. If you tell me leave, I'm going. That's just, there's a line. If someone doesn't want to take a picture taken, I don't take it. I don't think it's going to work anyway. So there's plenty of other people to take in the world. If they say no, it's no. Always respect their decisions.
Yeah.
Did you see a lot of outright, obvious police interventions in this zip code? Or were you aware of attempts at trying to really deal with these multi-generational systemic problems?
I tried 3 times to contact the police because I also wanted to have photographs from their perspective. So I contacted the Manhattan headquarters downtown and the precinct house twice. And I always got, nope, 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 nope. So I never really got a chance to see what was going on. And when I had arrived at the house, the police were often had just been there, or the FBI agents would show up. And I was there a couple of hours after they walked to the apartment. It says, "We found out who shot Malik." And he was sleeping. He told his mom, and then she went and told him. And there's a picture in the book where he's actually being told, "Jose Canaan shot you." And he's like, "Who's that?" So he was a hired gun that the gangs, one of the opposing gangs, hired to take him out. They're still after him, by the way. They still want to take him out. That's why when I'm with Malik, he only goes certain places. We can only go certain places. We have a real small zone that we can travel in. Otherwise, he will be taken out. That's the theory.
Boy.
Wow. So when you're hanging out with Malik and the gang, and it's a small room, and they're smoking pot or whatever, do you ever get a contact high?
Are you into hot boxing?
Yeah. Well, I've tried so many times. No, I know that photographers, I remember listening to Annie Leibovitz talk about this, and I just love her. And she was saying, when I was at the Rolling Stones, we did what the Rolling Stones did, and, good for her. But to tell you the truth, I've never smoked anything, and I've never had a cup of coffee. So, yeah, that's true. So, no, and they never asked me to. But I've seen so much pot. Sometimes the bags are so big, it's like the size of my leg, and there'll be 4 or 5 bags of the stuff. I'm like, wow, look at that. So, no, this never was brought up.
Right.
Huh.
Right.
That's cool.
But do you understand why some people do partake in crack and fentanyl, and forget about the addiction, but what motivates them to even get high in the first place?
Well, I'm dealing with this very interesting story right now about this gentleman who's half black, half white. His name is Red, and he was the product of the foster care system, which I'm involved with here on Long Island. If you are a mom who doesn't want the child when the child's born, and you just leave the baby in the hospital, that baby goes to an agency called Spence Chapin most of the time. And if they're on Long Island or Queens, I'm responsible for their health care until they're placed with an adopted family. Now, out here, we don't use foster care system because the government really doesn't want to pay you to raise children. They want you to go through being adopted. So I have a certain affection for this guy because he was born this way. It's drug-addicted mom, 6 months in the neonatal ICU withdrawing. And he ended up being taken in by a foster care family. And by 13, he was addicted. He just couldn't help it. He had that just incredible draw. I'm around the people who just are already doing it. And it's very complicated. No one wants to get in those situations, but the physiologic craving is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, the withdrawal from opiates, it's been communicated to me as, the worst possible physical experience that you can have.
Recently, I was with Red, and we were about Bill said 144, and he said, we got to go check on KB, one of the other guys he does drugs with. And Red does a lot of fentanyl. I said to him one day, what's going to happen if someone gives you fentanyl? You keep doing all this heroin. He says, no, I only do fentanyl. I said, you got to be kidding me. So we went over to the Mitchell projects and we went up to the 20th floor. This is one particular building. And there was KB lying down. He looked like he was dying. And he said, Greg, I got to give this guy some drugs because I got to save him. He's not going to make it. I was like, what? What is going on here? Sure enough, they injected him and he came back to life. It was like putting air in a balloon. The physiologic craving is incredible. And the withdrawal of the stuff they're doing now. Now they're doing angel dust or PCP with the fentanyl. And you should see the behavior. And when they crash, all hell breaks loose.
Yeah.
Do you carry Narcan around?
I do. Always one in the pocket and always one in the camera bag. Always Narcan.
Have you had to use it?
Not yet. I certainly know how to use it, and I've taught people how to use it, but I haven't. The Narcan is very available there. Most of them have it on them, and you really need to have several because most of the time you're going to use at least two. Right. When you use Narcan, you have to be careful because they will get very angry that you got them out of their high, and they'll start biting you. So, use it, step back, and see if you have to use it again. Yeah, I know all about it. I just haven't had to do it of recent.
Boy, the things we learn in this podcast, I can't. My pencil is smoking away here. I can't sharpen it fast enough. I know before we go for our mid podcast break, we touched on it a little bit, but I just want to go back towards the end of your documentation in 2022. You said there were a couple of intense incidents that made you feel that your luck might be running out as far as safety. Yet you're still up in the Bronx photographing, albeit with different subjects. Are there any particular signals you look for or listen for, or do you rely on a sixth sense when it comes to situations that could be going south?
So there's definitely a sixth sense that I rely on, but it's not good enough. So I also have informants. And in the book, you'll see a woman named Jo. She does Malik's hair. And she is on the floor above. And I've relied on her friendship for a long time to give me the word on the street. And also Ayana will tell me stuff straight out. And then there's other people on the street, Murder, Flip, these different guys. And they'll be like, Greg, you got to stay low. Be careful because everyone's starting to get nailed. And the word's out that they think Malik is ratting everybody out. So the thought was at one point, they took everybody down. Everybody got arrested because all of a sudden Malik's room got real quiet over a period of a couple of months. I said, Malik, what's going on here? He says, my guys are all gone. Everybody except me. And I thought he was going to go into jail. And his mom said, Greg, please, I know you're good with your camera. Malik, the judge is, they probably want to put him away, but they cannot take care of my son in the type of wheelchair that he has at Rikers Island or any prison. He is going to die fast. There are certain things you have to know about people that are in wheelchairs. And when they have these bed sores and they have open sores, which Malik has a lot of, the periphery of those sores are prone to a certain type of very aggressive skin cancer. And two of the guys in the book have died from cancer that are in wheelchairs very fast. So Malik has a lot of maintenance. He gets catheterized 3 times a day, his diaper changing, a lot of high-end maintenance. And she said, he will die very soon in prison. I want him home with me. This is his prison. She said, can you help me? And I said, all right, I'll tell you what. Let's stop everything and let's you and I work together. I'll make 10 8x11 prints of what is involved with caring for your son. And you can give them to your lawyer. And we're only going to tell the truth. It has to be honest. And whatever happens, happens. I said, but I think in the world of fair judgment, if you're guilty, you're guilty, and you need to do your time. And I'm guilty of backing over my son, and I did my time. So I said, I'll help you. And one night after I did all these things, took about 2 weeks, I really got in there with her. And I put them in a manila envelope. And after work, I went in there about 8 o'clock at night. I says, Iana, here you go. This is for you. Give it to your lawyer. And she gave me a hug. She said, I love you. Thank you. I just want him to be home with me. And he stayed home. But during the time when the people were disappearing, I did get the word, you got to get out of here because it looks bad. Don't be associated with him for a while. Eventually, I have all of the court records and all of the copies that the judges have, every single thing that happens with everybody that's in jail, whether it's Cassius or Do-Rag or Do-Man or X, Taco. I have a report of everything that ever happened in all of their meetings with all their lawyers. And it turns out that he actually didn't really rat people out as far as I know. And the people on the street said, you know what? Looks like he didn't really rat everybody out. It seems like you're okay again. So I just kept going. I never really stopped. I just kind of slowed down, but I did avoid the place for a little while. Took a little pause. But yeah, that's what happens. Iana said something very interesting to me once, because after a while I said I need some video footage, and I decided I don't know anything about how to take video. So I had this Nikon Z9. I said, well, I know I can do it, so I better learn how to use this Ferrari because it's a pretty complicated camera. And I went on YouTube and I learned a few things. So the videos that are on my website, there's 4 of them. I actually I filmed them myself, and I had a friend edit them. So they're really very amateur, but I think they do the job. But in there, when I was interviewing them, they said very different things than when we had the camera. And she told me, I am so thankful that my son is paralyzed. I am so thankful that they shot him, but he didn't die. And I said, well, how could you say that? He's in a wheelchair, and we worked on this project talking about what's involved with caring for him. And she said, do you know what would happen if he wasn't shot? He would have blown his whole world up. The whole place would have been taken out. Thank God he's under control and he's living under my roof and I can take care of him. She honestly said that.
Whew, wow.
So, when he was active, I think he was really, really bad guy. And if you watch closely at the end of my first video, I asked him at the end, just before he says, I love you. I said, Malik, do you know why you got shot? What's the background story? It's the only time I ever asked him. And he scratches his eye and he says, I don't know. And I'm telling you, from a physician's perspective, watching his body language, he's not telling the truth.
Right.
He's not telling the truth.
Yeah.
And that's where say less came from, because, I never asked. And I was there to take pictures. And if they said something, I heard it and I wrote it down. Otherwise, I'm not asking questions, because if I cross that line, I'm not going to be invited back. And say less also means we know what you mean. We know what's going on. So just don't talk about it.
Right. If you know, you know. And that's it. But this is kind of curious for me. Did you have a motive? Did you have a point, a real overarching kind of destination or kind of thing that you wanted to achieve with this work with Malik?
Yes. So, yes, absolutely. That's the $1 million question. So when I backed over and killed my son, the number one killer of children in America were automobiles. Okay? So I did not do this by myself. Jeanette Fennell was Kids in Cars, and she had been working on this project. And we did not even know at the time how many children were being backed over, because when you're backed over as a 2-year-old or a 65-year-old and above, it's on private property or parking lots. It's not on public streets, so it's not a statistic. The DOT isn't aware of what was going on.
Ooh, that's interesting. Wow. Okay.
We had to set up a database figuring out, okay, wait a second, how many kids are actually being killed here? And it turns out it was over 200 a year, 18,000 times backed over. And they were, most of the time, people live, but they were seriously injured. We only counted the mortality. So there was a problem. And I was a large part of helping figure that thing out and putting the cameras in the cars, and was bipartisan. So now, fast forward to today, the number one killer of youth in America, give or take the last year or two, it goes up and down, are guns. And it's the inner city, mostly Black, also Hispanic communities in these projects. And that's the reality. In fact, it's in today's New York Times. There's a whole data section on there and with very specific statistics. So I decided, okay, we're going to make something out of this. When you go and pick up a daily newspaper in New York City, whether it's a daily news, whatever it is, just scan it, which I do most of the time. Every day, there's at least one shooting scene in there, and it's usually police tape with police officers, and sometimes an inset picture of the victim and or the shooter. And I was like, wait a second. It's the number one killer of kids. I'm photographing these bikers. I've got someone that was shot. What the heck is going on? Are you kidding me? How do they live? What is it like? Where do they live? Do they have families? Do they go to church? Do they worship? What is going on? Who are these people? So then I decided to go with the camera and say, wow, this is what it's really like. It's about narcotics and it's about having guns because you have to be on the offense and you have to be on the defense. It's about living with mommy and respecting mommy and having children. You know, it's very, very complicated. So I don't have the answers, but as a Northwell Health System physician, I trained at Northwell, Michael Dowling is the leader of the entire health system. He was the person who sat on Governor Cuomo's side during the entire pandemic when every day at noon, when Cuomo would get on there and talk, Michael Dowling sat next to him. Michael Dowling is a very powerful person, and he is my, quote, boss, although I'm not necessarily an employee. He is still my boss. I trained under him, and he's a good guy. His mission is to be the public health leader on gun violence in the country. And he says it's not a political crisis, it's a public health emergency. So I wanted to make this book. I wanted to try to expose what is going on. We keep talking about it, but what does it look like?
Right.
And why do you do it?
Right.
If I was born into the military projects, I wouldn't be in medical school. I'd be carrying a gun too. There, but for the grace of God, go I, right? Could happen to any of us, right? It's
a really important thing to hold in your mind, this idea of luck, of moral luck, of your set of genes and the environment sort of coalescing to propel a life forward into a various future. And it also helps with understanding people as complex individuals who we owe an open heart towards, to hearing their story, to not dismissing people as just psychopaths.
Right.
Or one-dimensional.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People are very complex, and it's not fair to put people in boxes. I think we all try to do that to understand people. And it's just not a good thing to do. It's not fair. People are complex. And the beauty of photography and the photographers that you have on your podcast is that these people are using cameras to try to tell stories and show the world and in their interpretation. And it is a magical thing to be able to try to understand people with a camera, or at least understand a part of them with a camera. I'll never understand completely Malik, even though I spend a lot of time with him. But I've done a good job telling his story, and he and his mom are extremely thankful.
Yeah.
He wanted his story. People are like, how'd you do it?
Who else would tell his story, honestly? Who? There's nobody else knocking down the door to tell his story. People want to run away from him, not to him.
Right.
Right. It's very interesting. And this is a lesson that I had to learn because, I came to photography through the back door. Watching the B&H YouTube channel on wildlife photography and learning about gear. And I took a few Magnum courses, and I spent one day with Lindsay Adler learning lighting, and then one day with Victoria Will learning lighting. And that's how I learned photography. And then I have photo books. So I came through the back door. I don't understand a lot of the rules. I had to get sort of bumped around. I didn't get my master's in fine art at Yale or somewhere like that. So I didn't even know that a lot of people would say it's politically incorrect for a white man, middle-class suburban guy, to be photographing and telling stories of a black person. So I was very sensitive to that, and that sometimes made me pause. But at the same time, around the corner is this pastor, and this 86-year-old black pastor, and she's in this little old church, which is a broken-down deli from the 1980s when the Bronx was burnt out, and you had a deal back then. The government would give it to you if you promised to make something useful out of it. And I saw her on the street one day when Joe was informing me about what was going on with the gangs. And this pastor walked out on a Sunday, and I just fell in love with her. And I walked over to her. I said, "Hi, I'm Greg. You really look special." And her congregation was leaving, it was beautiful people. And I said, "Wow, this is such incredible culture." And she said, "I'd love you to come in and take a picture." So over a period of a few years, I went in there and took the pictures. But I had to stop it 3 different times, I said to her. And the third time was on Memorial Day. There I was after work. Everyone's out doing a good thing and having a good time, barbecues. And I said, "No, I don't feel comfortable with this." I had to go into the church and sit down with her and say, "Are you okay with a white guy telling the story in this culture?" It was a very sensitive issue. And she said, "Listen to me. We need our story told. God sent you.
Wow.
Whatever you do, keep telling it because it's got to be told and no one else is telling it. So just do it." She said, "If you need my blood, you can have my blood. It's the same blood. I don't care what color you are. Just don't stop and don't leave us. Please don't leave." And that moment is when I said, wow, because it was really hard for me. I didn't want to do something that wasn't correct. And I said, all right, I see your point, and I'm not going to stop. But I kept asking permission the whole way. Are you sure? Are you sure? And I kept showing them pictures the whole way. This is what I'm doing. This is what I have. What do you think? And no one ever said they didn't like a picture. If you bring back prints, which I do, a lot of prints, they love it. I said, do you like this picture? I get it retouched, and I blow them up. I have a big Epson printer, and sometimes I mount them on foam board. They go crazy over the pictures. Mm-hmm. By the way, the FBI has quite a few of my pictures.
Right.
Do they credit you, though? That's the whole thing.
Right.
I remember in court, they said, who took these pictures? And Iana said, there's a professional photographer who does it. And the police said, no, these are cell phone pictures. And she said, absolutely not. And we're not going to tell you who it was. And they wouldn't wrap me up.
Wow. Okay, we're going to take a short break for traffic, weather, and to pop more quarters into the parking meters. And we come back more with Dr. Greg Gulbransen and Say Less. Stay tuned.
Save time, gain space with all the right cards in the right place when choosing from Samsung's extensive line of memory products. From SD cards and portable SSDs to gaming NVMEs and USB flash drives, Samsung's full line of memory products covers all your storage needs. Head on over to bnh.com for more information about Samsung memory products or use the link in our podcast show notes.
Okay, we are back with Dr. Greg Gulbransen and talking about photographing gangs and putting together a book. And it's a pretty phenomenal conversation. This is one of the more fun ones you've had in a while. I have a question. You work with a past guest on this show, former editor-in-chief of Life magazine, Bill Shapiro, on editing and planning for your book. At what point in your documentation did you team up with Bill, and what kinds of insights and assistance did he provide?
So back in 22, I decided I was going to make another personal photo book. I didn't think I was worthy of having a published book. So I was dealing with Sasha Wolf, listening to her podcasts, and she helped me edit some pictures for a different project. And I had called her one day and I said, can I please have the name of a printer who can make a nice book for me? And she said, why don't you reach out to Bob Tursak from Brilliant Graphics? He does the work for Sally Mann, Mark Selinger, Ralph Gibson. And Ralph Gibson was really one of the forefathers of photo books. He has over 40 photo books, and he worked with Dorothea Lange, and he was friendly with Cartier-Bresson and all these people, Robert Frank. So through Bob Tursak, who I think is a brilliant person and does amazing printing, who I'm so lucky to have as a friend, he sent me to Ralph Gibson. And I contacted Ralph, and he saw the pictures, and he said, wait a second. No. This is book material. What's going on here? Let's talk about this. And Ralph is very, very intelligent man. And he sort of blew me away by everything. He says, look, let's do another session because this is a big deal. And I want you to know that this has got to go somewhere. So he said, I'm going to teach you how to edit. And I said, Ralph, you're a lot smarter than I. You know this business well. I work 7 days a week. I'm a doctor. I don't have time to learn anything more than I know. It's taken me long enough to learn how to use a camera. I'll never learn how to edit. I just know I don't have it in me. He said, okay, let me hook up with a friend. And he called Bill Shapiro. And then Bill contacted me and he said, what kind of pictures do you have? So I sent the pictures to him and he said, oh, okay. You want to collaborate? And I said, sure. And then we hired Richard Baker to actually design and edit the book. Richard was a designer for Vibe and a couple of other magazines. And he worked with Bill Shapiro at Life magazine back in the day. So remember, Bill was the editor-in-chief of Life. Mm-hmm. So we made a book. Well, we made a PDF of a book, I should say, with Richard Baker's design, which we liked very much. And ultimately, that's what we used to market the project to different publishers when Bill said, Greg, we've got to reach out to publishers. And I just said, you're in charge. I'm going to work. And that's how we ended up with Gust. Stu Smith at Gust is a brilliant person also. And Katie Clifford with Aperture now works with Stu, and she was very, very nice to me and very, very good. The whole team at Gust is actually very powerful. A good press team, good everybody. In fact, what's interesting is Bob Tursak from Brilliant Graphics was willing to get involved with the printers in Italy and give some suggestions on duotones and stuff like that, stuff that I'll never understand. So it was a nice teamwork, team effort. There's a lot of people involved.
And these are people who actually cared about photography and publishing, which is more important Because a lot of people go, yeah, and they're basically just trying to get another piece of work into the hopper so they can make a few bucks. So your connections were good.
It's interesting. They really do all care, and they really like telling a good story. And if I look at the Gost list of the books that they've published and the different photographers, I was like, wow, that's an impressive list. I mean, Jonas Benelson and all these people. I'm like, you want me on that list? So they do care a lot, and they're not going to just take anything. So book publishing is an interesting field I know very little about, but it's interesting.
When it came to the publishing of the book, did you present any of the book designs or photographic selections to Malik or any of the other gang members? Were they part of the process, or at what point were they aware of it, and did they start seeing what it was all about?
Okay, so let's go back. I had to get signatures from everybody. I had a lawyer write this up, releases. Everybody that had a picture of. Once the pictures were selected, even pictures that we didn't use, I still got.
Sure.
Then another lawyer, my brother-in-law, says, okay, great. Now that you've done it, show them every picture, show them all the text that's going to go in this book, then have them sign a second release. So I did. And I said, I feel much better about that, because it was always that nervousness about, oh man, I'm going to get shot when this thing comes out. I'm going to run. I'm moving to West Virginia. So I actually took my laptop in one night and I sat down and I said, look, these are the pictures. Can we all sit together and look at the pictures? They were so happy. And then I had the hard copy, the handout of the text. And I said, look, this is the text and these are the releases. Read everything first, and I'll come back in a few days. And if you don't feel comfortable, I will take away anything you don't want, we'll take out. I went back a few days later. They said, we love it. Please do it. Signed everything. So I'm 2 releases thick. And
that's amazing.
Yeah, it's very important. I'm a public figure as a physician, and I cannot afford to be nailed, right? I've always walked on the edge. I walked on the edge of the line. And even that car thing was scary for me. People left my practice thinking, I'm not going to be a good doctor because I killed my son. And, could you imagine what that feels like? So you have to be careful in life, and you just don't cross the line. And Matt Black says it best when he does this Magnum course. He talks about the relationship you need to build with people and the honor you have by telling their stories and how you owe them the time and energy to tell it properly and rightly with respect. And because we all have our biases, And I always follow that mantra. I take so many notes when I listen to these lectures and these podcasts, even the ones that you guys do. I write down these copious notes and I study them at night sometimes, just to try to do things right, because that's how I learn photography,
So here's a question. You mentioned a little bit earlier something about taking notes when you were hanging out with the guys. Did you actually?
Sometimes I would actually write something down. A lot of times I go into my car and write it down, or I dictate it into the phone, just to remember who said what to whom. I have lots of pages of notes, particularly with the gentleman I was photographing. There's a section there of just people in the neighborhood who were shot, who were not part of Malik's little group, but in the neighborhood that were shot. And I had to remember their names, what year they were shot, what their story was, who was thrown under a car, who was shot twice. So I had to write these things down. And I did take copious notes. I'm a big note taker. I do that. I did not do any background research for any of this project, although I do research everything in life and my other projects, but not this one. This one was just follow it by the seat of my pants.
And what about when you were in the midst of photographing? I mean, there are pictures in the book that are very much posed portraits. Were those actually posed, and did you go back and forth with the subjects?
So the gentlemen particularly, like if you're watching some of the older gentlemen who were shot in the air, I say, hey, can I take a picture? I'm doing a little project. You're like, yeah, sure. They're look, they're not doing anything. I said, I'll the print, they want their story told. So I said, let's find some mixed light. Maybe you could stand next to the building. I want a little shadow coming across the side of your face, whatever. And other times it was just like, look, can I follow you guys around? And you'll see there's a scene in there where there's guys shooting heroin. So that is actually between buildings and these alleyways. All these buildings have little alleyways between them. You're going to walk through where the superintendents go, and there's like little caves down there. And you don't want to use a flash there because that light bounces around and it'll bounce up and there's many floors of people who will say, why is there a flash down there? And they'll just call the police right away. So I just had someone hold an LED light, but they're doing their thing. I would never ask someone to do drugs. They're just doing their thing. And, and you just sit there and say, you build a relationship and you have someone hold the LED light and you just quietly take the picture. Now with the monochrome Leica, to tell you the truth, I never use the flash again. That thing just goes, who cares about ISO? And
which one do you have?
Well, I have the Q2, waiting for the Q3. That's a hint to Leica, monochrome.
Okay.
And then I have the M11, which is much harder to use, because it's not autofocus. You have to dial it in.
No, it's true. You autofocus before you take a picture.
Yeah, bang, bang, bang. But the M11 is harder. But when it takes a picture, there's tears in my eyes sometimes. I just can't believe what that camera can do. Also, the monochrome. So I do everything in black and white. Although, my compositions, these stories are not really about color. If color involves composition, then it's part of the story. I need to take out my Nikon, I guess. But most of the time I'm doing hardcore, just tones of grays and whites and blacks. So I'll just use the black and white camera.
Yeah, I use the monochrome, and again with a fast lens, and you just set the ISO up. There is no need for flash.
No.
It just sees forever.
No, it doesn't matter.
It's a perfect camera for the kind of work that you're doing.
Yeah.
But we've covered a lot of territory here. Before we wrap up, I want to briefly discuss a very different connection you have to the image making and public safety issues, and we've touched on it a little bit. Back in 2002, you lost your 2-year-old son in a really tragic car accident, and you channeled your grief into a hard-won campaign to get the American auto industry to install rear-view cameras in cars, which we now take for granted. This seems like a rather obvious and essential safety enhancement, but you faced a lot of headwind trying to get government legislation passed. Can you talk about how you dealt with your incredible sense of loss and guilt over the accident and transformed it into saving other people's lives?
My life did end there. That was it. I was guilty of that. And ultimately, as part of the healing, my nickname is the Scarecrow Society, where people don't take blame for their actions. And I said, no, I'm taking full blame for my actions. I did this. I'm responsible. Now watch what I'm going to do. So I'm going to teach my children a lesson, and I'm going to do something productive here. So I actually joined this little effort with Jeanette Fennell and Kids in Cars and lobbied Washington, D.C. And George Bush right away made it the 2008 Kids in Cars Change for Safety Act to get this rear visibility standard set and to deal with it. Because back in the day, there was no visibility standards on vehicles. You could sell a car in this country with no windows and no mirrors, and it would sell. There were no standards on visibility. So we said, all right, we have to establish a rearward visibility standard, do some statistics, do some work, and then work with consumer union and then DOT and figure out, well, what's the safest way to deal with looking backwards? So Hillary Clinton, myself, and many other people, we would take an entire kindergarten class and put it behind a Chevrolet Escalade and sit them down, like 30 kids, and get in the car. Hillary Clinton would get in the car, I'd get in the car, and use all the mirrors, and you couldn't see one kid back there. So there's a problem. So the legislation was passed, but then it was stalled. So in the Office of Management of Budget, there's this other office, small little office that meets in the White House. And they go, it was a little committee, ORIF it's called, and their job was to make sure the government isn't wasting money. So there were two different leaders of that little group for those years, and they both said, nope, this is a waste of money. Who cares? What idiot would drive over their 2-year-old? That's what they said. I said, I would never drive over my kid. So it was a fight. I never lost a fight. And then that's when I picked up the camera. And I remember walking, trying to photograph snowy owls at Jones Beach, throwing up on the beach, because the lawyers told me, you're going to lose. It's not going to work, because we made this lawsuit to sue DOT. And I said, no, we're going to win. Something's going to happen. And I would walk with the camera. And I didn't even know how to use the 600 millimeter used lens I had. And I would just, cry and throw up and stuff like that. And eventually, time went by, and the lawsuit was going to happen on a Tuesday. We were set to lose, but it was going to take place in New York State. It was Gulbransen et al. Against the DOT. And Obama was in office, and he refused to get involved. He did not support it either, which was a surprise because they were very child-geared. Yeah, his wife was very, very geared towards helping children. But he said, I know it's got to pass, but I can't do it. So we sued him. And I was told, you're going to lose on Tuesday. But on Friday at 4:00, I got a call from the head of the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, said, be in your office with your family at 9 o'clock on Monday. And hung up the phone. And I said, bang, I got it. So, I get emotional about this. I called the lawyers in Washington and I said, hey, we're going to win. And he says, what are you talking about? I said, NHTSA just called me. And he said, we're going to have a teleconference at 9. And he said, what? The defense is not allowed to talk to the prosecution. I said, we'll win. Something happened. And it turns out there was an ignition switch interlock problem where General Motors, if you go back, knew, and the DOT knew, and the engineers knew that the ignitions made in certain General Motors cars were faulty and people were dying, and it was a hidden secret, and it was being exposed that week. So the following week on Wednesday, there was going to be a hearing about this, and heads were going to roll, and DOT was going to lose big time. And they decided last minute, we can't look like we're against people 2 times in 1 week. So we're going to lose the General Motors and we're going to admit our mistakes and fix it. But we're going to pretend that we really love kids and we're going to go on the side of Gulbransen and we're going to jump. So last second they jumped over. So on Monday morning at 9 o'clock with my son there and all the lawyers listening in from Washington, D.C., the head of NHTSA got on the phone. He says, I'm very, very sorry, but we've decided to change our mind and we're taking your side and we fully support this and we're going to make sure it gets done right away. So every vehicle in America under 10,000 pounds, except for motorcycles, will have cameras. It'll be mandatory. And I said, that's important because, where I practice in my office, this is middle class, upper middle class. They all have cameras in their fancy cars, $3,000 features in the navigation, right? You have this navigation thing, you have a camera. But that's not what a lot of America can afford. And this has to go to everybody. This has to go to every single person who can buy a vehicle. It's not fair. And eventually it would trickle down when people buy used cars. So that's actually how it happened. It was all about timing, and it was all about fighting, and it was all about trauma, and it was channeling my grief. And thank God for photography, because that's how I got through it. And it all involves cameras. It's the craziest friggin' thing.
Yeah. Oh. That's amazing.
I can't add to anything to this. Your story is just amazing. I'm in awe of how you take a truly horrible incident. I mean, I'm a father and a grandfather, and I'm listening to your story, and it's really hard for me to wrap my head around that. And I don't know how I would handle, let alone survive, going through that kind of experience. But I'm in awe of how you took it and you turned it into something that's constructive, and in fact has no doubt saved God knows how many lives so far, and will continue to do so. It's awesome. So between your Bronx project and this, a life well spent, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you guys for your podcast and the education and all the voices you give to everybody, because it's really important. It's how we teach each other. It's how we take care of each other.
Yeah.
Yeah. If our listeners, no doubt, would like to see more of your work and catch up with what you're doing and stay abreast of it, where can they go to?
So I'm a little bit dicey. So I have this website, which I'm going to have to update, which will be there. But really, if you want to know about me, I have this Instagram channel, and it was called Greg Gulbransen Peds, P-E-D-S, one word, one right across, Greg Gulbransen Peds. And that's where I was telling my pediatric stories. And then they said, well, Greg, you better make a photography page. So I made that, but, I don't know, my heart wasn't into it. So I decided to sort of combine the two, and it's sort of taking off because it's all about telling stories related to kids. And sometimes things are a little bit hard to mix match, but people seem to like it. So, there I am in action doing my thing, and there's links to the pictures, and I'll be putting stuff up about the book soon and giving more information. I have to time it for when the book comes out, and all, but that's what it is. And I'll just be out there doing my thing, grabbing my camera, taking care of my family, and most importantly, just taking care of children, trying to do the right thing by kids.
Oh, Godspeed, sir. Godspeed. We'll be posting your links on our show notes so people can actually click on it and follow you and keep up with what you're doing. And thank you for giving us time today and telling us your story. It's truly inspiring and wonderful, very uplifting. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much. You're just wonderful people.
Thank you, Greg. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
You guys are class acts.
Takes one to know one.
Yeah.
Now, if you are a fan of the show but not yet a subscriber, head on over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, B&H Photos YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts, and click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog, where we post photos from our guests along with our show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast group, where you can share your favorite photos and comments about the show. I'm your host, Alan Weitz. Jill Waterman is our creative producer. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein, and our executive producer is Richard Stevens. On behalf of all of us, thank you oh so much for tuning in today.
Thanks to Samsung for sponsoring this week's episode.